Hello, and welcome to this video where we will be continuing our discussion from data and information lifecycle, where we have seen the various stages of how data and information exist, to something what is becomes an input to that life cycle, and that is the data classification policy an organization may have, and what are the principles that an organization may use to help in classifying the data. To begin with, the data classification can be at a very higher level be done either based on the context that it is being presented to. For example, the metadata, which is the data about the data, the classification can be based on that. It can be based on the content of the data. For example, in the file related to a patient, the HIPAA related characteristic or the patient data can be in the file, and the classification can be done based on that. And the third categorization or the classification can be based on the user based or the user understanding of data. Looking at a file, someone may be able to perceive whether the data present there is a client data, is it talking about the journal company process, or is it talking about something else. So this classification is very important. Now, if you delve a little deeper into that classification, there are various classification per se that can be applied to data. For example, it could be top secret, it could be secret, it could be confidential, it could be even unclassified. Something which is, for instance, the organization have yet to decide on to put to one category or the other. It could be confidential, it could be private, sensitive, and a public information. For example, the financial reporting or the loss and loss and profit of an organization, which can be presented in the yearly reporting and which is a public information. It is important to understand that this categorization is not one size fit all, which means not every categorization will be applicable to all the organization. They may be done based on the necessity for an organization, the kind of business an organization is in and how they perceive their data classification best serve them. There are, of course, additional category, for example, official use only, which is more related to government related data and regulators. And there is also category of limited use, which, for instance, you cannot propagate proprietary data or a data reflecting to a trade secret and things like that. For a clear contextualization, it is important to understand that data classification is a bit different from data categorization. So you can classify data, for example, the three ways that we have seen, but the categorization of the data can be even granular than this. So that's why these are two important concepts which needs to be well differentiated. Now, as a matter of fact, we have seen unclassified data, but it could also mean that we have unlabeled data in an organization. And what should you do with it? How should you treat it? Well, the rule of thumb is that if something is unlabeled and that organization has not made up the mind, that it should be treated with the highest classification possible. Of course, that classification can be temporary, because if it turns out that the data is not of the category like top secret, secret, or confidential, then you may lower down the classification and then can use the data accordingly. So that's why the temporary part. Now, if you look at some of the data classification principle or the ideas that drive the data classification per se are quite generic in nature. For example, you need to mark the objects, which is done by a process called marking or labeling. And what does it do? The label is used to allow subject with the right clearance to access them. So for example, if there is a file, you can assign a clear label to it, whether it's secret, top secret, classified, unclassified, etc. You also have to mark the subject because the subjects have clearance or ability to access the object, which is done by what you call as a handling process. Now, it is important to understand that the object and subject are not always differentiated by being non-living and living. So it's not that the subjects are always human being and categorized as a living entity. It could also be that a file or a process is accessing another process or the file. In that case, a non-living file or process can also be marked as a subject and object accordingly. Of course, when you build this labeling and the clearance, you want to assign it through a formal approval process as to which subject should get clearance to which object. So therefore, the formal approval process is also equally important to have, and the process should actually govern how you manages the interaction between the subject and object. What helps there to derive such a process is that you follow certain core principles of security, and those are need to know, give only as much as access to subject as what is required for subject to perform the job. Again, I'm not using pronouns like his and her because, as I said, and subject could also be a non-living entity. Another principle that can be applied is what you called as a least privilege principle to give the bare minimum access right to the subject on the object such that the operational processes of an organization is not hampered with, but again, the operational processes are not getting overexposed. It is imperative to know that the data resides in an asset, so the data classification in its whole and soul may not give you all the information, and the asset classification, on the other hand, will add up to the information that the data might try to project. For example, an asset classification may tell you who is the asset owner, how much data that it holds, and what is the data retention period that may be applicable to the asset. So let's stop here. I hope you have enjoyed this session, and I hope to see you in the next session. Thank you very much.